All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We are going to be talking about identity as the foundation of trust. My name is Filip Verley. I'm a product manager for Airbnb. I am 6'4", and you can trust me on that. Nick Shapiro took a lot of our thunder this morning, but we're going to build on a little bit of what he was talking about and how identity and trust are key drivers of the future economy. So I'll let the panel introduce themselves real quickly.
So my name is Will Summerlin. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Pinn. At a high level, we have a platform that combines legacy identity management technologies with behavioral biometrics, traditional biometrics like face track, and kind of combines it together so you can effortlessly and very securely authenticate individuals.
So George Kurtyka. I do tech strategy and partnerships at a small little bank called JPMorgan Chase. It's a little regional bank. I think you guys might have heard of them. Really.
I have a question about fees.
I'll have to refer you to the terms and conditions on our website. So working with our identity and digital account opening teams on their tech strategy and partnership strategy.
Great. I'm David Kelts. I lead IDEMIA's technology and design for our mobile identity products and our identity proofing platform. IDEMIA is probably not a name. I'll spend a couple seconds on it that you may have heard. One of our, it's the coming together of Morpho Trust, Morpho Track in the US, and Oberthur into single companies rebranded as IDEMIA. In the US, we have one of the main businesses is that we help ensure you are you and that you receive the driver's license that you're intended to receive directly in your pocket, or as I call it, a physical world primary authenticator. And I help the team transition over those things to the digital world.
Hello, my name is Stephan Wolf. I'm the CEO of the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, a not-for-profit Swiss foundation. And I would like to start with a question. Who of you has not heard of the LEI before? A few? That's good. So we can hopefully help you. The global LEI system was created in the aftermath of the Lehman crisis with this big collapse where nobody knew whom they were dealing with and what kind of business they had with whom. And the LEI system and our foundation is managing a network of partners is basically, the closest analogy would be an international business registry for legal entities.
Great. Let's just jump right into it. And the first question I'm going to ask the panel, all of us, how has the digitization of the world impacted how you and your company are either doing business or building solutions? So Will, I'll start with you.
Sure. So there's really a big trend that everyone's aware of, which is more and more of our lives are coming onto the internet. And that's everything from shopping to the government's critical infrastructure. With that, there's this terrifying trend of cybercrime. And there's estimates that cybercrime is going to cost the world over $6 trillion a year starting in 2021, which would make it one of the biggest losses society's ever had to deal with. And it's only growing. And so if you start to look at that, the center of that is identity. It's people's digital identities being stolen. And most of the time that occurs through simple things like phishing or passwords. And so there's this opportunity at the same time to try to start to solve those problems. One of the challenges, of course, is people don't like friction. And when you think about security in a traditional sense, it always involves more friction. And so the question is, how can you provide a high level of security without introducing a lot of friction? The good news about this digitization is a lot of these devices that are coming online, whether they're computers, cars, smartphones, anything, they all have a lot of sensors. And those sensors are constantly collecting data about how people are interacting with those devices. And so if you start to look at artificial intelligence and the power behind artificial intelligence, we can actually start to recognize patterns within those streams of data and use those patterns to enhance security and provide a higher level of assurance in somebody's identity. And so for us, there's this terrifying trend that's occurring that I think keeps a lot of people up at night, but it also represents a massive opportunity. And so with all the new devices coming online, with our lives moving online, we have to secure them. We have to develop a higher level of trust in people's identities. And if we don't do that, it's going to be catastrophic. And so for us in particular, I think it's created this big opportunity. And I think that's something that a lot of the companies here can share.
So George, at this regional bank you speak of, how are you guys handling digitization of the world?
Yeah, I would say it's digital everything, but it's balanced with a real omni-channel approach. So obviously we still have a lot of branches, but in those branches, for example, there's these things called ATMs, which are inherently digital, and a lot of what I think can be done, to modernize even just the digitization of branches through electronic consent and electronic signature, are things that we're doing, even to modernize things as old as branches, right? I think our customers still some customers prefer high touch, and they prefer this, the kind of convenience and safety of going into a branch. Now, will the branch today look like the branch tomorrow? Seen some great examples. ING in Amsterdam has these advice centers where you kind of go into a branch, but there's kind of no money to get there. It's more of an advice center. So, we're looking at things like that and how branches evolve. But beyond branches, certainly I think digital account opening, the ability to we've been able to be very successful at marketing. Or not marketing, for example, our Sapphire card, right? We did almost no marketing with that thing, and it was a lot of word of mouth, and all of that was done digitally. Like we didn't, you couldn't get one piece of paper that said apply for a Sapphire card. So, we do believe in obviously the massive digital transformation for a bank like us. It's actually quite slow, but you're going to see a lot of really good improvements. Those of you who are Chase customers, thank you very much. You're going to see a lot of improvements in just features, and really a lot of it is not only just adding new features, but also reducing the friction and building trust, to take it back to the panel topic. So we know who you are, we know the kind of transactions you make, and we should protect you while also reducing the friction for allowing you to do things like make payments.
David.
So I described one of the businesses of the company in a very physical way. Yet there's a lot of drive to go digital on this, to take that card from the back of your phone in that little envelope, that little wallet thing, and put it on the front and make it part of the phone. So there's a drive for that, and the challenges around that, there's several challenges around that, and one of the biggest ones is, I described it as proving you are you and making sure the card gets into your pocket. Well, how do you reliably, on a mobile device, prove that the person is the intended recipient of a mobile version of this and provision it directly to their phone in a trustworthy manner? That's one of the huge challenges that's there in the digital space as IDEMIA moves digital. And then once we put it there, it's not just a sort of dematerialization of a card. It's also, this is a supercomputer in your pocket that, like you just said, that communicates. So how do we create the trust, and trust is the operative word, and we have to define it, that allows people to use this? So we've had to sort of break trust down and look at it from different perspectives. As a company, I think it's caused us to, because it was kind of where the question came from, it's caused us to start a sort of digital core, reorganize into a digital core, and then as the products are completing and going outward and out towards consumers, which is a new space for us, then you can see the sort of digital transformation in the people in the company as well.
Obviously, computers are around for a few decades, so digitalization, I think we need to explain this a little bit. With the internet and all these visions, 20 years ago, it was the first time that people could actually communicate with each other over this medium, and that ended up in the creation of large platforms that we all use today. The future digitization is more a distributed supply chain, pretty much like in manufacturing, where you have components that are delivered in real time. The components could be real assets, could be virtual assets, data, and you get payments of that. And I would like to give you an example, just an idea. I'm not sure if anybody's working on this, right? So your fridge could order a glass of jam, a drone could pick it up from a warehouse, deliver it to you, and then an intermediate payment provider would draw the money from the JP bank account without JP having the say into this. This is a reality today, and in this entire process chain, with all these firms and people involved, There's no human interference. And that means we need to trust this system very much, and how to establish trust, I think, is what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, thank you for the lead-in. You prepped for the panel. That was great. So, you know, I'm a firm believer that identity is the foundation of trust. But is it that simple? Is it just identity as the foundation of trust? And again, in the digital world, what elements can we rely on beyond the traditional pieces of data, such as, you know, name the number, SSN, SIN card, the government-issued ID? What other pieces of data could we rely on to build that foundation?
Wish it was that easy, but no, there's a lot of challenges. And talking about something that you touched on a few minutes ago, when you think about identity, there's also a supply chain issue with identity. And how do you maintain integrity throughout that entire supply chain? To put that into different contexts, think about biometrics. If you think about a fingerprint on your phone, when you enroll that fingerprint, how do you know who is enrolling that fingerprint? Just because Apple says, yep, fingerprint's good, how do you know you can trust that? I'll give you an example. My girlfriend had her fingerprint on my phone, and she went on Amazon and bought something and used Touch ID to pay for it. And I remember I got this email from Amazon, like my receipt, and I was like, I didn't buy that. What's going on? Turns out she had my phone. She paid for it. But to Amazon, that was a trusted transaction because Touch ID said it's Will Summerlin, you're good to go. But that wasn't the case. And so if you go one step back, so maybe you take a picture of your driver's license before you enroll it. Well, how do you know you can trust that driver's license? How do you know it's not fake? And this keeps going back farther and farther and farther. And so there's this really big challenge in identity in terms of supply chain, maintaining integrity throughout that. And when you think about, you know, date of birth, social security number, these kind of static things we always use to identify us, that's completely broken. Just after the Equifax data breach is an example, and they're not the only ones. Everybody's getting breached. But now a lot of that information is freely available. And I was reading a report the other day. For $25, you can go online and buy somebody's bank account, username and password, security questions, email, date of birth, social security number, you know, mother's maiden name, all that stuff. And so that information is really no longer valuable. So the question is, how do you find this core root of trust? And ultimately, any core root of trust can be compromised. And so I think it's gonna turn out to be a multitude of different variables that you look at. Maybe it's things like government-issued sources. Maybe it's things like devices that you've seen across a network. So I think there's going to be multiple pieces that come into play when trying to establish that core root of trust. But that supply chain piece is really important.
Yeah, I would never put my girlfriend's fingerprint on my phone. So
I didn't do it, by the way. She went in and did it herself. That wasn't me.
George, tell us more about that.
So I agree on the multiple signals, right? I mean, I think that obviously we live in a world where everything about you is out there and readily available on the dark web. So number one, the thing is, you know, we have to protect our customers, the things that we know about them, you know, the signals that we have, the shopping history, the patterns. Like, you know, we can identify a lot of that stuff with our own data, and then using a lot of you know, our partners and vendors and those in the audience today, you know, we use a lot of your technology and products to build those profiles and those risk profiles, and being able to trust, you know, our customers, either our Chase customers or new to Chase customers. So, so SSN, DOB, mother's maiden name, KBA, like, those are all great, but those are all signals to a bigger kind of picture and how you build that trust. And you know, I don't think like anybody's got the silver bullet solution at this point right now. So really, that's what risk is, right? You're building kind of a confidence score based on a multitude of factors, and you know, you'll see the technologies like, you know, 2FA, Face ID, Touch ID really help. You know, driver's license scanning, Internet of Things devices. You know, device biometrics and the way that you know, key, you know, through things, and the way you hold your device, geolocation, all of that stuff is going to be signals to build a risk score to make you reasonably confident that that person is who they say they are, but there's no foolproof approach yet.
So I'm going to challenge the question a little bit. So David Birch, who I have to talk well of because he's sitting in the front row here, said to us yesterday that we have this all wrong. we're going the wrong way, you can see that we are. So I want to challenge the notion that data is identity. Identity is not data. So play a game with me here for a minute, if you would. Keep your attention up here on the front, on the panel, boring as that may be. And imagine now, out of your periphery vision, someone really close to you, your spouse, your partner, comes and sits down next to you. How long did it take you to recognize that person, to understand who it was? Think for a second, right? Really not that long, right? Humans are really good instinctually at this, at understanding identity. So now, next phase, how long did it take you to have a feeling about that person and a feeling that you trusted that person? You know your history with that person immediately, and you know the trust. All right. That person sat down next to you, and how often does this happen? They ask you for your social security number. Okay, so if you're filling out forms for schools or camps or things, right, a couple times a year you get asked this question. We all instinctively know that we should not write this other person's information down. We should not store it. And we don't do that. We ask for it when we need it. So let's look at that as, see if this is the challenge of how we can build our systems. Systems can recognize who the other person is, know from the history of your transactions with them, even if it's new, that there's some level of trust and understand that, and then come around and ask for the data when it needs the data that it's going to perform some kind of action. This would be a paradigm that would work, I think, for increasing the trust, because there wouldn't be really these data stores. So I don't think the next piece of data is, I think there's a sort of way that we can do this and a way that we can move towards doing this that might actually start to create the trust that both sides need in these identity interactions.
The question of what identity actually is almost a philosophical one, and I would like to add to that a little bit. A legal view. Identity is conferred by the sovereign, nobody else. They issue passports, they have business registries, they have tax offices issuing numbers. We have a situation right now in the world that many countries do not have this kind of capacity. So look at Africa. One of the biggest problems there is they cannot participate in global trade because they have no identity. They don't have a passport for international trade. So many firms, among those yours and yours, are now trying to do all of this mapping exercise, fetching data, biometrics, everything else to get a better feeling of who you're doing business with in the end. But I think the underlying problem is that we lack a standard for identity, a global standard that everybody can trust. I would like to own my identity. I don't want to have an Apple ID or an Amazon ID. I want to have my ID, right? And then I associate the attributes that I would like to associate with that, and I will expose only those attributes that I would like to expose. And therefore, we need a global standard. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment that we see. In my case now, the legal entity standard is now emerging, but on the natural person side, there's nothing.
So speaking about that standard, it's interesting. What would the standard be, right, for an individual's identity? As you mentioned, for entities we have, it's starting to come, the work you're doing. But what would be the standard?
Coming back to the passport example, if you like, we all have a passport, right, in order to travel. That's the only application that I know of where you need a passport for. And then you have many countries, like the one where I come from, where you have ID cards. Now, the passport is a global standard. You can travel to any place in the world showing, the border guys, your passport, and you're in. So obviously the world has agreed on what they consider a standard. And that comes with data, that comes with biometrics, that comes with now, all kinds of other analysis. And this passport is then used across the world. Now, this passport is not, necessarily identifying you as an individual, because there's vital information missing. For instance, you could have 2 passports from 2 different countries. You can have passports without any address details. So how do you know where you live at the moment in time, and so on and so forth. So national governments have already started to develop ID cards, right? I don't think in the US and in the UK, but in most other countries, there are ID cards. They are more sophisticated, more information, more biometrics, more everything. The problem is you can't use it anywhere else, just in this one country. So we need a passport, and I would start simple, you know. The ID is a label to the real individual or the real organization we're dealing with that is usually expressed through attributes, whether it's behavioral attributes or data attributes, and then you can deal with that.
So going back on that, obviously passport, not everybody can get one. As you mentioned, there's a lot of countries that don't have that infrastructure. There's a lot of people that don't have access to that standard. So let's say that supply chain is broken. Harping on your supply chain idea here. What would you try to, how would you get these people up to that standard without the ID? So, you know, trying to challenge that.
So that's really hard. You know, it goes back to the root of trust. How do you develop that initial root of trust in that person? And that's really challenging. But at the same time, you know, you could start with digital. The identity that you develop around that person, instead of having a physical passport, could be something that's digital. I know of a company, no affiliation, but a company called Smile ID that's focusing on Africa in particular. And the challenge there, of course, is people want to set up bank accounts and you know, get microloans and all that kind of stuff. But because they don't have that infrastructure in place, the fraud is absolutely insane. And these banks don't know who to trust. And coupled with that, the other challenge is the infrastructure. A lot of people have you know, very slow phones that are, in the U.S. standards, you know, would be from the late 90s, that have very little internet connectivity and very few sensors. And so they're actually using facial recognition, a more advanced, enhanced version of traditional facial recognition, to basically develop this registry for the banks in those countries. They've actually started to partner with the governments of those countries as well to try to develop a central registry based on facial recognition that people take using a camera on their phone. And obviously, you know, a semi-sophisticated hacker, an unsophisticated hacker could probably break that. But it is a start. And I think as we see these countries starting to move into the digital world, they might just very well skip that physical component and go straight to digital, which is a really interesting trend.
Yeah, I want to plug a friend's company, but Juvo, I don't know if Steve's in the crowd, but they're doing some really interesting things in kind of building that risk and trust profile on prepaid, like mobile, with prepaid companies in emerging markets. And you know, as you continue to top up and pay and not overdraft your prepaid mobile account, you're able to unlock more access to money, to funding, to other services in those markets. So I kind of like what they're doing, and I've seen other companies kind of do something similar like that. So yeah, I think it's certainly not going to be, you know, there's maybe a combination of carriers, because everybody needs a mobile phone in order to transact in this day and age, whether it's an emerging market or it's established market. So harping on just some of the things I've heard in the last couple of days, you know, you need collaboration across multiple entities, banks, carriers, utility companies. You know, these are things that in some cases may not report to credit agencies, or there's no credit agency to report. So you need collaboration across those multiple industries, I think, in emerging markets in order to build that profile. And so there can't be one single entity to do it. So great startups out there that are doing that work, and I think that's kind of maybe the way of the future.
So real quick before you answer, so having a government involved, important or not important? Even if they don't have the infrastructure, somebody comes to them with the infrastructure.
It depends on whether or not you want the identity to be legally binding. I think this is an important point you brought up, but if you want something to be legally binding, having the sovereign state behind it is really important. But for many applications, maybe there is no legal infrastructure that would make sense for it to have that authority. And so if you're just trying to do things like apply for microloans and get prepaid cell service, I don't think it's important. But if you're trying to use it for things with a larger commitment, and you do want that legal authority, I think it does become important.
Well, I was going to touch on the standards topic, but if your sovereign-backed identity actually did protect your privacy, and allowed you to use it as you wish, and even with pseudonyms, like perhaps we would use it. But on the standards front, I know, because I glance around, and as fuzzy as it is with the lights, I can see a few people involved in the standards work here. There's multiple different standards for identity, and they all have really good characteristics to them. So we've got, in the authentication space and the biometric space, we have standards. We've got things like UMA, user-managed access, for access to data, cloud store data, where several of the people here, there's an ISO group I'm involved with. I spend a tremendously inadequate amount of my time on standards. But, and there's several, if you want to join one of those efforts, or better yet, if you're creating a product, read through them, find them, pick one, write to it. Let's start to standardize, because the fact is we're continuing to go on this pathway of the proprietary way, which isn't going to cause the interoperability we need and isn't going to solve the problems we need.
So, Stephan, how did you guys have a breakthrough in the legal entity identifying scheme? What was that point? Because, as was mentioned, there's standards, but there's 10 of them. And if you have 10 standards, you don't really have a standard, right? So how did you guys make that breakthrough?
So in this particular case, there was no standard, funny enough. And so after the Lehman crisis, the regulators, being endorsed by the G20, came up with, the idea that a legal entity identifier would be absolutely needed for managing the systemic risk in our financial economy and everything else. But this has spread much further than that. What we try to do is, and I would like to add a few buzzwords, we talk about identity, authentication, authorization, all these kind of issues when we talk about trust networks. We have not touched base on the difference between an identifier and a role that someone plays in a certain context. All of these things will add to the complexity, and what we've tried to do, and still trying, I must say, is we tried to lower the complexity and take all of that out. So we're not talking about the application, we're not talking about authentication. Whatever you do with your LEI is your topic, and everyone who wants to build an application around the LEI, fintechs, big banks, whatever, they can do that. We are just taking care that the information associated with a unique key, a label, if you like, that the information associated with that key is validated against publicly authoritative sources. And that creates the level of trust into the LEI, which finally the banks use, for instance, in their reporting to the government.
What is the big hurdle standing in your way right now to build solutions that instill more trust with your consumers?
I think one of the challenges is consumers' perception of security and what security is. I think there's been this stigma for a long time around biometrics in particular, Face ID, Touch ID, all that kind of thing, or fingerprints, because people have this idea of, well, all my data is getting stolen, right? Data breaches happen all the time. And if somebody captures my fingerprint and they have a data breach, what happens if my fingerprint's exposed? I only have one of those. I can't change that. My password I can change. My finger I can only cut off. And so I think for a long time, there's been this stigma associated with that. I think Apple and Samsung have done us a huge favor by introducing those types of technologies through iPhone and the Samsung devices. I think people have become a lot more comfortable with Touch ID, with fingerprints, especially those being stored locally. I think people are becoming a lot more comfortable with facial recognition. And so there's this change happening in the consumer world where people are more willing to adopt these types of technologies. And simultaneously, people are becoming more and more concerned about their own security. I think most people at this point have experienced identity theft. If they haven't, they definitely know someone who has. And people are becoming really worried about that. And so if you can introduce precautions that those people can take that don't add a lot of friction, that at the same time can start to reduce their risk and give them some sense of visible security, I think you're going to see a lot of adoption. And so for us as a company, that's been a big challenge, but I think that's starting to change in the right direction.
And George, just for you, a little bit of a different flavor on that. Banks are trusted. How do you keep that trust as you see what's going on? How do you make sure that whatever trust consumers have in you, what are you guys doing about that?
Yeah, I think Largely, so one example I can give is, we believe that customers, have and should own access to their transaction data, for example. So we have executed multiple partnerships with data aggregators, Intuit being one, where they've got 4 or 5 products, Mint being probably the biggest, where customers want to use these PFM tools in order to build a full financial snapshot of their lives. And for us, we recognize that, and we've gone out and executed a partnership, giving an API access to someone like Intuit to avoid the kind of screen scraping that goes on with a lot of the other aggregators. So we are implementing kind of safety, security, convenience through these agreements that we're signing, through through APIs and through using standards like OFX, but also then protecting our customers. I think oftentimes, maybe, I don't know about you guys, but I sign up for every fintech app that's out there, so I'm pretty sure my account is linked like everywhere. But how cool would that be to actually have a dashboard to see where your account's linked, right? So, today, if you use Mint and you have a Chase account, you could actually see that your account's linked, and you could turn it on and off inside like a dashboard, like a security dashboard inside Chase. So that's where we see kind of the future is. Yes, we agree and believe that your customer data is yours, but we also need to be able to do it in a safe, secure way where our partners adhere to certain data principles, things like they won't sell data, customer data to third parties, that they will use an API and move off of screen scraping. So, so for us, I think that's the challenge is there, and I think we're open to those types of partnerships.
So the question was about hurdles to trust. So before I look at the hurdles, I kind of want to break down how we've viewed trust in our space, because I think all of us in the room, or it's a pretty common theme, I think we tend to look at it from the relying party point of view, and that trust is accuracy. I want to know that that is Scott, and only Scott, and that's the accuracy point of view. But when you put an identity on a mobile phone for somebody, or you enable them in a cloud account, you have to turn around on the other side and take a look at it and say, what constitutes trust for the consumer? From their point of view, think of your identity on a phone, right? This is the supercomputer. What do you want from that thing? You want to be protected. You want your privacy protected, and you want to have total control over this. And you're right. It's as Stephan was saying before, it's your right to control your identity. So when you look at it from both of those perspectives, then you look a little different as to what you are going to build. So in terms of the hurdles to that, I think that there's some hurdles in the privacy space, with it being really maybe not looked at as favorably as it ought to be, and yet as individuals we are all concerned about it. So there's some architectural hurdles, and one of the ones that I think is kind of maybe most provocative, information processing standards. Probably one of the biggest hurdles we have. These are all based on an assumption that I'm going to store a lot of data, I'm going to safely process this data. Cool. Where I said in the beginning, though, I'm not sure that that's the thing that protects the privacy. I'm not sure that's the thing that has the consumers trusting us. When they'll start to trust us, when we can take sort of an ask, don't store model and ask them for the data that we need, and they can trust that we're not storing it and we're not doing something with it. That's a really tough changeover, but it's one that fits how we work as human beings and maybe the place that we need to head towards. But there's several hurdles and some time for that to develop out, but maybe the shared vision of it might help.
So let me start with the good news. We have no shortage in technology. Consider that solved.
I think that's also the bad news too.
We have bright people who can deal with technology. Well, to control them sometimes is the issue. But technology is not the issue. I had my first digital certificate almost 20 years ago, and we're still talking about the same crypto libraries and so on and so forth. We've come a long way from those initial steps on the internet to blockchain today. So technology is solved. The bigger problem, in my opinion, is the question who pays for it. So identity is usually a public good. The government confers identity, as I said. Unfortunately, we don't have a global government, or gladly, whatever position you're going to take. But in this particular case, there is no tax money that could pay this on a global scale, because there is no global authority who could do that. So the only way of financing such a system is then to go back to the markets and ask, for some voluntary dollars for that. And you can do this in two ways. You can do it like some of the big data vendors, where you get the ID for free, but the usage of the data costs you money, to your point, and all the security issues. Or you charge the registrant, and that means you have 1 million unhappy customers in no time. So it's the consensus in society, and consensus, I think, especially among politicians, ourselves, the community, to agree on how much identity is worth us to invest into. And I think that discussion will take quite a long time. So my biggest hurdle is money.
That's a good hurdle. So, as the news has been out there, big tech is getting a lot of, headwinds from DC and other areas. There's a lot of big news last week. What would you tell big tech companies that have a trust problem?
That's a hard one. I mean, if you think about companies that people trust banks inherently. People are
starting. Do we trust George?
I don't know yet.
No, he's big tech over there.
No, and so there's always been this trust problem, and I think I haven't built a bank, so I can't say how
it's really easy. By the way.
How I develop trust as a bank. As a tech company, I think people used to be naturally trusting. When people set up an account with you, they used to naturally trust you. If you go back one step beyond that, they didn't trust you. But we got to this point in technology where people would just give away their information. They trusted you would keep it secure, and everybody was happy. And now with all these data breaches happening, and especially with the whole Facebook incident that just happened, people are becoming a lot less trustful of these big tech companies. And so I think they have a lot of reputational damage to work on. But I think the one thing that they could do is be very transparent with their users. And Facebook is kind of taking this approach and trying to recover from the incident. But be very transparent about the users and say, here's what we're collecting, here's what we're using it for, and give the users control over that data. And so, I think if people know what data is being collected and they have control over deleting that data, really deleting their profile, they're more comfortable. With that said, that might have economic impact on these companies since they use that data for value creation, for advertising and everything else. But I think that's one step they could take in the right direction. And I think the other one is just to show users and show people how they're securing the data in the most simplistic way possible. And it doesn't have to be really complicated standards or security diagrams, but just in a very conversational way. Here's how we secure data, here's how we encrypt it, here's how we keep data device local so it can't be hijacked or stolen. And just kind of taking an educational approach, I think would also be beneficial. But that's a really hard one.
Yeah, I mean, transparency, privacy controls, accountability, liability. I think there's, in the absence of regulation, listen, banks are highly regulated financial institutions, and we're trusted to guard that data. I think Sheryl Sandberg said they're open to more regulation. I don't know what that's going to mean. Does that mean like if my data was accessed by Cambridge Analytica that I should get a check in the mail? I don't know what that really means, right? So it'll be interesting to see what the continued fallout is. We obviously live in a country where there's a very short attention span to these types of things. So the next news cycle, people may forget about this stuff. Let's not hope that happens, because I do think there needs to be attention paid to these companies where you are the product. You're getting something for free and you're giving away access to your data. And I think that's gone, and not to harp on the keynote from yesterday, but that that's gone largely unchecked and unregulated, and I think we hopefully will see more action being taken on that front.
I don't know that I'm qualified to give recommendations to big tech companies on it. I'm one evening's reading into Scott Galloway's book, so, but I think, I do think Will nailed one critical piece of this is control, and I railed on FIPS, but information processing standards, individual participation, this is one of them. Maybe we've underserved this one. So whether it's kind of self-sovereign, whether it's citizen-managed, user-centric, whatever it is, that let's maybe try to increase, or if we have data on people, let's try to increase that individual participation and the control that people have over the data.
I mean, we got to be realistic with the big tech firms. They make a lot of money in owning your identity. Coming back to my point, we should own our identity ourselves. How can we convince the big tech firms to change that? That's going to be seen, it's a little bit of a challenge. But when we talk about control over data, we mean basically access to data, but not ownership. And I would advocate for ownership of that data.
And as a consumer, do we want to withdraw from big tech, right? Because we get all these good fun stuff so easy. Stephan.
Let me give me coming back to this little drone example, right? So we're all used now to shop online, but do you shop online with a small firm you've never heard about from a different country, perhaps, just because they sell a very nice product that you would like to get for $100? Probably not. You would go to Amazon and buy it there, even at a higher price. So trust, the flip side of trust is risk, and the risk that you're willing to take in a business transaction. And the identity management piece is to lower the risk for transactions so that more businesses, smaller shops, more countries can participate in global trade and not just go and route everything over one big platform.
One more question for the panel. So if you look 5 years into the future, what does this look like? What does trust in the economy look like?
I think in some ways it'll look completely different. In a lot of ways, it's going to look the exact same. I think this is a really big macro trend that's happening, and those take a lot of time. Those don't happen quickly. And I think tech companies, might be early adopters in some of this, and I think financial services is another sector that's adopting this more rapidly than others. But I think really that the start is going to be developing a stronger digital identity. I think digital identity right now with passwords and all that stuff is completely broken. And everybody knows that. And people don't like them. They're a pain in the ass to use. And so I think that's the first big change we're going to see, is the way people create digital identities and the way they validate their digital identity when they want to use a service. And that's already happening. And that's one that doesn't take a lot of heavy lift to implement. So I think 5 years from now, we're going to see alternative mechanisms to assert your digital identity used across financial services, across tech companies, across all these services that we as consumers interact with. And on the flip side, I think you're going to see it at work. At work, passwords, two-factor, all that stuff is a pain in the ass as well, and it also doesn't work. And that's another area where those access and those credentials give you access to things that are very sensitive, customer data, sensitive corporate information, financial data, et cetera. And so I think corporations are starting to recognize that that's broken internally as well. And so there's this shift to change that and make that stronger in the same way it's happening on the consumer side. So I think over the next 5 years, that's probably the biggest shift we're going to see in terms of identity, in terms of reestablishing trust. But there are other things that are going to take a lot longer.
George, is the bank going to become a new social media platform?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that the evolution, we will live in a post-app economy where voice will be maybe a channel, chatbots, like taking those services to the channels in which the customers want to be in. So should I be able to go, hey Siri, call mom? Did any of your phones call your mom? No? But I could say, hey Siri, send George $500, and that's really where you need to throw up voice biometrics, different types of security, geolocation. So as we move to the post kind of app economy where you're taking those services to where the customers want to be, not necessarily the branch, not necessarily our owned assets, but in those third-party channels, making sure that you're able to layer in the trust and security and all sorts of the signals that are going to need to evolve to make financial services more convenient for customers in those channels.
This is a really hard question for me to answer because I look at from a couple different angles. One is kind of the pace at which we're making change today, and then do I extrapolate that out for 5 years? Or another, when you mentioned Siri, it kind of triggered for me. So like
hopefully you didn't call your mom.
I looked at my phone to see if it did. So I have little kids, and I broke out a Bluetooth speaker, just a little one the other day. I was playing music on it, and they start saying, "Alexa, can change to the next song. Alexa, I want to hear this." Right, just a little Bluetooth speaker. So, and the world also that they live in is changing really much more rapidly, and the expectations that are coming from people not that much behind us in age, that are coming up, and in the 5-year zone, those expectations are high. So I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. I know we will see, just at least from my company and plenty others, we're going to see attempts at digital identities, attempts at mobile identities that will be out there, and rallying around trying to use those, of course, is one potential, change that we can see as going forward, or might trigger some changes and some innovation.
Stephan?
You all mentioned the name Alexa. I should share with you. My friend is called Alexa. You can imagine what kind of jokes were made already about that name. No, seriously. Sometimes I have the feeling, and this is my private opinion, certainly not my professional judgment, but sometimes I have the feeling things have to crash against the wall until we all want to change. So the crisis, the financial crisis, other crisis, maybe now the Facebook crisis, whatever, these kind of events force us to rethink what we're doing and which path we are. And unfortunately, we humans tend to change only in cases where these big failures occur. So having said that, please do not read into me that I'm looking for the next failure. This is not the intent, but it's just an observation.
And since you're affiliated with G20, that could get weird.
Yeah, then they would all fail.
This concludes our panel. I want to thank everyone on the panel for joining today and providing their information. I think we're at the early stages of this conversation, and I look forward to the next 12 months and see where this thing can go. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.